This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Ismail Sezgin, director of the London-based Center for Hizmet Studies. Thanks for joining us, Ismail.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
Please bear with me for a minute as I give our listeners a bit of background on the subjects we're going to discuss today. So, Turkish cleric Fetullah Gülen, who has been living in the U.S. for decades, is the leader of a vast Islamic network that has long been based in Turkey. In the 2000s, the early years in power for Turkey's AKP, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, was allied with Gülen and his movement, which became known for having thousands of its members working in the police, the judiciary, and the military. The AKP and Gülenists had a falling out that began in late 2013 and culminated with the failed coup of July 2016, which Erdogan blames on Gülen and his followers. The Turkish government has since labeled the Gülen movement a terrorist group known as FETÖ. Sorry, stop that. Something else.
Sure.
The Turkish government has since labeled the Gülen movement a terrorist group known as FETÖ, dismissed 150,000 suspected Gülenists from their public positions, and thrown some 50,000 in jail, while also chasing down suspected Gülenists and shuttering Gülen-linked schools around the world. The movement, as a result, has largely disappeared within Turkey, while outside Turkey, its operations have mostly moved underground to avoid detection and attention from Turkish authorities. Ismail, you have a doctorate on the Gülen movement, so please tell us, if you will, tell us a bit about it and particularly how it's doing in the wake of this vast crackdown by Turkey, which is still continuing today.
Well, I mean, it's a big question in itself, but to start with, conservative Muslims in Turkey were always under such scrutiny. What happened in the first crackdown was in the wake of Republic, when Atatürk banned all the religious institutions. Many of the religious groups have gone underground. Some of them have closed down because they were all declared illegal, like dervishes, whirling dervishes are illegal in Turkey by constitutional law, although they have get the recognition back. And so the groups divided in various responses. As I said, some of them gone underground, like Naqshbandis and Qadiris, for instance, they still existed. And people like Said Nursi and later Fetullah Gülen still wanted to be available in the grassroots level, which later turned into a very successful movement through the education, through the outcome, through creating upward social mobility from less fortunate, less fortunate background people had chance to educate and go a higher level. So it created a crisis, and then which they tried to push back in, which they did push back in various coup attempts in Turkey. The seculars actually pushed that sort of attempts back, like regularly every 10 years. And the later one, in 1998, in the February, the soft or postmodern coup attempt, which were in a way not as successful. So since then, Islamic movements, both political ones and non-political ones, both like the trend that Erdogan represents and the trend that Gülen represents, become successful, but eventually they are being pushed back now again. Of course, Erdogan is not in the same sense. Now he's pushing back the other society to gain control more over the religious groups in Turkey, so that he can have a sustainable government, or he can hold 50% of the majority at least. And so the Hizmet movement is being crushed in Turkey. But in a way, if you look back in 1995, it was the same. 1980s, it was the same. So we have this period where after 2002, when Erdogan came into power, the movement wasn't as persecuted as it used to be. So people tend to forget that, like as if there was a different story before. Gülen was on the run for 6 years after 1980s Kenan Evren's coup attempt. So his movement was persecuted. Many senior people were on the run. They were
Well, yes, this is why he's in the U.S. right now, at least partially. But are you saying that the crackdown right now is no more harsh than those in previous eras?
No, the crackdown now is more harsh. More harsh. That's definitely. It's just because there is different things at play. There is a stranger coalition at play. The crackdown is done by a more religiously known faction of the society or political system or parties. So which means like majority of the religious Muslims can overlook that, so they can deny simple basic human rights of people, because no one really cares, because it is for seculars it is oh, that's good because the religious people are crashed down, so no problem. For religious people, if the religious authorities or religiously known politicians like Erdogan is crushing down another religious movement, probably they deserved it. So they can decline basic human rights, like, for instance, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, or people should be able to at least use the banks to transfer money. Recently, I've read that people couldn't withdraw money that's sent to them by their relatives because they have been purged by a government decree. That sort of really, really basic human rights have been ignored, and there is no advocate for that, because if anyone starts advocating for basic human rights, they have been persecuted as well. If anyone want to, let's say, support the people who are in prison or their families outside and sell food, they have been put into prison as well. So these are like this level of persecution is very rare in Turkish history, with an exception. Of course, this is persecution. In 90s, we know JITEM used to pick up Kurdish activists and just shoot them in back of their heads and leave them around, like thousands of people, 17,000 casualties like this, which we are now still seeing, that mothers looking for their children, the Saturday mother. So with the exception of that level of brutality, but all the social exclusion, all the persecution, all the harshest possible human rights violations are there. So
speaking of that persecution, you are one of the few who remains openly and publicly supportive of the Gülen movement, which in Turkey, as you use the term, it was long known as Hizmet, meaning service. You run the Center for Hizmet Studies and have been described in Turkish pro-government news outlets as a Gülen propagandist. I wonder, why have you decided to remain open about your support of Gülen and the movement when many others have gone quiet or hid their links?
Well, I mean, there was, of course, a series of events. I was actually planning to go back to Turkey after I finished my PhD and set up an NGO there, like a think tank NGO there, about these sort of religion and religious minorities, and I wanted to work there because my background is political scientist. I have a religious traditional madrasa education for 5 years, and lots of ways were already close to me in Turkey. So I came, and after my PhD, I wanted to go back as an academic. But by 2013 and 14, I realized, as my topic choice, the moral responsibility in Gülen's writing would not be welcome in Turkey. I wasn't sure whether even the higher education authority would accept my PhD in England. And then it got even worse. So what happened is, as soon as I submit my thesis, I thought it may not be a good time to go back and set up an NGO about religious minorities in Turkey. So I decided to stay in the UK and do that in here with the similar people who have done PhDs about the movement, but not necessarily won't be able to go back. Of course, it's 2014. The things are not as bad. So we set up this institution. If you can trace back, you may find other names, but maybe it's not a good idea for them, because they try to remain unknown as much as possible and still pursue their academic interest, like 2-3 of my friends, and they have family members in Turkey, of course, like me. So, but I remained a bit obvious because my wife is from Pakistani origin, so she's totally different to, like outsider to this topic. And when the coup happened, she asked me, what do I really think? And I gave her an answer. Then I decided to post that answer online. Then it got, some attention. And then I got I was invited to BBC Hard Talk. So I thought I would talk as an expert on the topic, because they were really difficult. They were having real difficulty to find anyone to talk, to give an account, because that was such difficult times. And after that, I realize actually there is a way to contribute to society with the thesis that I have done, with the academic work I have done. I don't have to throw that all away. So I still do some, video blogs in English and Turkish. I speak about it, and there is a divided community that watches me. Some things that, like you, for instance, the way you mentioned, is that I defend or support the movement, and something that I'm trying to deconstruct and harm the movement with my critiques, and I lead a campaign against it or something. And I understand that people always want to hear one kind of truth that they would like, and when they see that is not totally represented, they either tag you as a black or white, and they are not used to gray, and that's okay. So that's
speaking of that, we can get to a little bit more about what exactly the center does. But beyond attacks in the media, have you faced any harassment from the Turkish government or from AKP supporters or your family?
I did harassed by AKP supporters when I was on BBC on a program and on live. I was actually threatened to look out for myself. And that actually sent a chill down my spine at that moment, because I have a little daughter, which she needs a lot of hospital care. And, so she's a lot dearer than I would, let's say, imagine at that time. So it made me feel like, oh my God, I am in a position where I have to worry about my children, and maybe I should stop. But at that fraction of moment, I remembered this movie about the devil's double in the Saddam Hussein's children and his duplicate, and how he used to pick up the girls that he likes and then kill them, after he abused them, molested them, and whatever, because his father run an authoritarian regime. And I thought, you know what, if I don't pay the price and speak up, it'll be even more difficult tomorrow. So maybe I should just speak up for the sake of my own kids. That we have to give a fight, isn't it? If everyone, as they do now, worries about their children and don't speak, and then it means like their children will have a tougher time to fight for their own freedom. So we have to either take it on board and do it ourselves, face the risks, or we have to leave our kids even a much horrible situation, much stronger regime, much stable regime that it's hard to overcome, like Putin's Russia or Khomeini's Iran, something in between. So I thought, well, all I can do is at least speak up about the truth, and I think I'm sensible enough to not necessarily politicize it. I think there is a way to just stay in human rights activism, regardless of what's happening, and also stay in the, as an academic, be respectful to truth, at least, even if you have some wishful thinkings, to manage that to a certain degree, and just contribute and make it a sensible discussion, because there isn't a lot of people who is discussing movement without any, preconception or predefined position.
Speaking of which, I should mention that pro-government Turkish news outlets have linked Ahval News to Gülen. As far as I'm aware, this news outlet has zero connections to Gülen or his movement. That's not the case for the Center for Hizmet Studies. You mentioned your YouTube page, which has more than 21,000 subscribers. I took a look at it. You seem to post a new video there every few days, and most of them are about explaining the ideas of Gülen and his movement. Is that the focus of the Hizmet Center?
No, it's not. That's partly why I couldn't do. Hizmet Center's focus is about information research and analysis on Hizmet movement, and that's it. When we set it up, the idea was we could like harvest some of the knowledge and experience within Hizmet, like the work they do about radicalization, extremism, and education, ignorance, poverty, that sort of stuff, and provide it as a report to wider Muslim communities in the West or the wider world. And on the other hand, we could also harvest some information that might be relevant in transformation of the movement. So two-way. Yeah, of course, after the coup, it got difficult, but we still wrote some reports or contributed to the Foreign Affairs Committee in UK Parliament when they were writing a report on the coup attempt. We did some media appearances. Mainly I did the appearances because it makes sense in a way to just keep on the same person who's already been targeted, let's say, not to expose other people. So, but I don't want to diminish their role and their contribution, because they do a lot running of the social media and preparing the reports and everything. It's just my face is more public now. And we do produce some videos about how to take on the coup and the narrative, and because we spend a lot of time on this issue. But I realize it is a limiting role as an academic within the Center for Hizmet Studies. So I started initially my English channel, which has got like 3,000 subscribers only. It's in my name. And I used to speak in English in a very difficult time. But at least English was a safe language to speak all this, because you don't get that regular Turkish abuse and harassment because people don't understand what you're talking about. And then I got this Patreon support. Like a number of people started paying my, expenses via Patreon, which is a platform, American platform, I guess, to support this sort of activism.
Yeah. Clearly, you spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about Gülen and his movement. Are you a member of the movement?
Well, membership is a strange argument, because nowadays people are here who are applying for asylum and they are asked the same question, and it's a very hard thing to prove. So because there is no formal membership, it's just like any idea. Like, for instance, if you were a socialist, let's say, there isn't a membership really. You can but say, well, I am a member of this organization and that organization, which is affiliated of socialism and this and that. So it proves that I might be a socialist and whatever, something similar to that. It's adherence of certain philosophy, and Gülen's philosophy is about the religious interpretation of Islam. It's a modern interpretation. It has, whether we like it or not, it has actually transformed the religious communities in a big way in Turkey. And I am affected by that, because my background, as I mentioned in the beginning, is I have trained in a traditional madrasa for 5 years. Then I went into political Islam, Milli Gençlik Vakfı, and that was their name, at least MGV at that time. Now it is different, I know. And then from there, I get introduced to Said Nursi first. And I had a really dislike of Gülen himself until I saw him on the news with Reha Muhtar in 1998 when he was defending himself. So I started to develop a respect on him, but I didn't know a lot until I finished my university degree and started a thesis where I started from a totally different point of view. But because of my supervisor, I moved into religious movements, and specifically Gülen, then specifically on Gülen rather than the movement. So I think it affected me a lot, because now I know more about him than all other scholars combined. So it really affects how I think and how I affect. So it has a day-to-day effect on my understanding of Islam or implementation of Islam. So it affects me a lot. But
it's interesting. It's interesting that you say there's no official membership, because I've spoken to at least one possible former Gülenist who told me he didn't even know whether he was ever a member. So there's not some official acceptance or welcome or anything. A person might not even know whether he or she was a member.
I think that's, again, for instance, if we take the question, who defines that? For instance, Home Office declines a lot of, let's say, teachers whom you would assume as Gülenists are not Gülenists, for instance. They have to fight their case. There have been 1 or 2 extradition cases that I have witnessed. I have actually, as a Center for Hizmet Studies, we provided a statement as far as we can understand, this person would be perceived as Gülenist in Turkish authorities' eyes, sort of, and we do that sort of regular expert opinion, giving expert opinion as well to best our knowledge. We provide that help. But for instance, as you mentioned in the beginning, according to Turkish media, I'm probably a senior member of the Gülen terrorist organization as they frame it. And that just means that you don't agree with their point of view, which happens to Ahval, which happens to the director of Amnesty in Turkey. He was actually accused of coup attempting and membership of FETÖ as well, because of, I think, Baylok or something, and many others. Like, if you raise an eyebrow, you are a FETÖ supporter, a crypto supporter, whatever. So that's a totally contentious area. But in the in the reality of, in the academic neutrality of the TENS, there isn't a real membership it's not a secret membership or anything. There isn't one. It is just an idea of volunteers. There is a lot of networks within the movement, and I am aware of the certain social...
Right, but that's the question. Like, don't members or quote-unquote members get some sort of benefits, advantages of being a part of this network? They are helped, they are assisted to get a job or to get a connection. And if you're not a member, then you don't get... So, there must be some line that one crosses in order to begin to start getting that help. I mean,
it's about who you know, isn't it? Like, for instance,
sure.
Who's your friends? Who do you hang out with? What circles you hang out, and what's your real, in the sense of like LinkedIn network or however you define it. It's like your friends and how you perceived. As I said, for instance, in a lot of circles, my name is a very contentious name within the movement. I'm aware of that, so they find it really dangerous, for instance, and because they don't know me and they are skeptical.
Wait, who's they?
Well, majority of the people who get to know me by my videos, for instance, they don't know who I am really. So they just watch the videos and they don't get the exact feeling and trust that they should get, for instance, because they feel like, let's say, skeptical because that I talk about Gülen as Gülen rather than, for instance, mention him as Hoca Efendi, because for me it is an academic topic. And
so you mean to say that like Gülenists are almost as critical of you as Turkey and the AKP?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that there are some very funny comments I get all the time. Like one of them comments in every video, regardless, and one of them where I do an analysis of Gülen's, for instance, recent self-critic articles in Çağlayan magazine, which I do regularly. And he says, I'm really surprised the fact that you are aware of all this terminology. And now I'm even more skeptical because that makes you even more dangerous. So that's sort of like, that's understandable. People are persecuted and they're afraid and they look everything suspicion. So that's understandable. I'm not making a big thing out of it. But it's just like the fact that, for instance, people don't know you and they feel like everyone somehow betrays them or something, because no one really support Gülen and his case, or the people who have been persecuted because of their membership of the movement or their affiliation of the movement. So people are very, very skeptical. And I get that a lot. I mean, like, it's just enough. And I don't erase those comments as well, as far as they don't take it to the next level and harass me, like, or use abusive language, then I erase them. But you can go down the videos. If you have a little Turkish, you can see how people warn each other about, how damaging my videos could be for the movement members or whatever. It's just because...
Well, I've learned in the past few years, if you write about Gülen, whether it's, the Turkish view or the Gülenist view, you will be attacked, pretty much whatever you write.
Yeah, and that's why people sometimes keep writing about that as well, because that is that's a topic. Sometimes even if you mention, you will get the attention as well. Mm-hmm. And because now there is like a group of people whose job is to just harass these people, like actors or whatever, and a group of people who have nothing but social media accounts to defend themselves, and people are very, very sensitive. So that's understandable. That's all I'm saying is it's just, but I know that whatever I'm saying now will be there for me 10 years later. So I don't want to be a laughing stock or anything. So I try to be as careful as possible, because since I started this new media outlet, let's say the video and terror and stuff, I receive a lot of anonymous tips or this and that, like loads of information, and I have to be really careful as an academic to just see whether I can determine there is fact behind it or not. If I were to take them all and say, oh, my sources tell me this, my sources tell me this, sure. I would have a lot of videos that I should be ashamed of now. But I tend to not go in there, because my motivation here is that I'm an academic. I have a PhD. I have invested a lot of time and effort into this topic of a theoretical knowledge of Gülen, and I have a certain amount of practical knowledge of the movement, and I have access to people, and I also know the wider Islamic thinking,
Okay.
from the
Okay. So
political side.
I'm gonna test
Yeah.
that knowledge a little bit now. So Gülen has denied any involvement in the coup. Yet a number of top civilian Gülenists were at Akıncı Air Base, known as the coup headquarters, on the night of the coup or the morning following the coup, and were caught. What were they doing there, do you think, if they were not involved in the coup?
Well, again, that's very, very interesting issue to discuss. I'm talking this to Adem Yavuz Arslan, Kamil Maman, and we have actually did a series on each of those civilians and what did they say and how. And it's at one of the videos that we get a lot of critiques from the movement. At least some circles, they don't really want us to discuss those issues. They want people to forget about that. Okay, that's understandable. So there is some sort of a sensitivity there, which will reveal itself. But in my opinion, as an academic, like I am looking at the numbers of people, because one of the, for instance, Kamil Maman thinks that they might be there to make sure the movement members have joined the coup attempt, as a confirmation, because it's very unusual, very unexpected for civilian members to be in those circles. It has never been heard of. They should be really limited amount of communication with non-civilians. It's like an unusual thing. But then on the outcome in the morning, according to government numbers, if that is true, around 150,000 people purged. I think like up to 30,000 of these 20,000 of these are military officers. And on that night, only 1,000 officers or something attended this attempt. And a lot of people who have been purged later have actually fight back. So if those people were there to encourage the coup from the movement's point of view, it looks like they failed. Majority of the movement members either remained loyal to government or they fought back. Nonetheless, they have been arrested or persecuted. The 30 people who have been assigned as with that extraordinary order as what's the Yönetim Komutanı? How would you translate that? I don't know. As the commanders after the coup, they have been all arrested, but majority of them actually fought back to coup. And the other 60, according to my understanding...
Well, that's a separate issue. I mean, there's no denying that the vast majority of people who follow Gülen were not part of the coup,
I'm saying vast majority of the officers who have been accused of being Gülenist member, 90 or 95% of them didn't take part in the coup. So then the question is, either those people went there to encourage them to do this and they have refused to join in, or maybe they were there to, discourage them to join. That might explain the mentality of them being there like an extraordinary issue, because at that morning we have seen, according to persecuted officers, when you look at their numbers and the people who joined, majority of the movement members, 95% of them didn't join the coup attempt, and a big chunk of that 95% actually resisted the coup.
Okay. Well, look, an August 2016 report by the EU Intelligence Analysis Center found it unlikely that Gülen himself played a role in the coup attempt. Knowing the movement as you do, and pointing out now, that 95% didn't join, is it possible that Gülen had no involvement, but that some of his followers were involved and perhaps believed that they were carrying out his vision?
I think some of we know this as a fact that some of the Gülenist followers have been involved in the coup. We don't know whether they were following Hulusi Akar's orders or their superiors' orders, because we know they have received an order from the chief of staff, isn't it, at that night, which later destroyed, or you may have seen a picture of it at least, but they have received an order. But they might have joined it because of because they were Gülenist and fellow Gülenists were persecuted. They have had that motivation. We'll never know that. But we know at the end of the day, there is a small group of people who have joined this coup from the Gülenist front as well. That's like established. It's just there is nothing shows that this was a predominantly Gülenist attempt. It's understandable Gülenists who had the motivation to, let's say, not to stop this coup or join in. But in that case, we can see 95% of them really denied joining in. So that says something because of the principle. And the next day, Gülen was very clear in terms of denying their involvement. In terms of he said, whoever joined this has actually betrayed our principles. And the very interesting thing is, I have had an interview with Kerim Balci, who's misrepresented on that by the Ahval editor, by the way, is that he actually said when he was asked on that night, without any prior knowledge or anything on the spot, that the presenter said, Mr. Kerim Balci, these people, some media outlet says that these people are Gülenists. What do you say about this, on this possibility? And he said, well, I say, like the Ikhwan-ı-Muslimin leader at the time when some of his colleagues committed a violent crime, he said they are neither Ikhwan nor Muslim. So they are not our brothers or Muslim at all. I deny their involvement and their action and everything. So for me, he said, if this is done by people who perceive themselves as Gülenists, I declare they are not my brothers.
But it's easy to make general, broad statements like that. But it's different to be specific. I mean, among those arrested at Akıncı was Adil Öksüz, who was released 2 days later, then fled into exile. Turkey says Öksüz was the ringleader of the coup, and travel records show he went back and forth between Turkey and the U.S. regularly, as I'm sure you know, including just a few days before the coup. What's Gülenist's view of Öksüz? Has the movement condemned him for his apparent involvement in attempting to overthrow the Turkish government?
Well, there is one, I'm going to be academic again here. There isn't one single view. Gülen definitely condemned, and Gülen, in a way, mentioned him as like a traitor and has probably done this with the MIT. But my understanding is Adil Öksüz has a lot of friends in higher level.
Gülen used his actual name and said that.
He said he mentioned his name as with Hakan Fidan, very contextualized it. I have a video, like 2 videos about the specific thing, but he said he denied that I didn't know him really well, sort of like, I don't know what even his code name was probably. So he insinuated that he might be working for MIT. He made it a bit, he made that definition a bit earlier, a bit clearer, but I understand he didn't want to emphasize a lot by investing a lot of it, like saying he is an MIT member or something. But he denied that involvement. He said, oh, he came here, yes, like Hakan Fidan came here, sort of like he contextualized in a strange way. But the strange thing in here is, and he denied any people who are involved as traitors to the core principles of Hizmet, and later AFSF declared those principles and reaffirmed that thought. But the problem is, in the higher chambers of the Gülen organization networks, let's say, there are a lot of individuals who have really close ties with Adil Öksüz. So somehow that information doesn't reverberate enough, let's say. I sometimes make a joke, if 10 years down the line, I may not have a good reputation as Adil Öksüz have, because he's kind of protected within the Hizmet movement. There is a group of people protecting him, just like within the government there is a group protecting him. Like, for instance, recently one of the ex-Zaman journalists have revealed that he is a business partner with Süleyman Soylu, which explains some of the issues, how he can be released.
He's still a business partner with Soylu?
He was, apparently. I don't know whether it is still, but there is strong connections in there. And on the other side, with the movement senior members as well. I know some of them by name, but it's not a concluded, I haven't really concluded all the facts, so I don't want to expand too much on that. But I know, like, the reason he's been protected, like, people try to leave him out of debate at least. Like, we don't know why he was, and we never had a chance to ask him, sort of thing. Although Gülen clearly said anyone who take part is a traitor to the principle, so that can finish that conversation, but it is not. There are some people who wants to leave him out of the debate, or who is not happy when you bring his name in your videos and stuff. That's fine. The other thing is, for instance, I read a woman's, and we have to look at this context as well. There was a woman who recently had her she had her daughter with her in prison. And the reason she was in prison is because she threw away some of the Gülen book after the coup attempt, and the police or neighbors found the Gülen books in the bin. They called the police get fingerprints, and her fingerprints was on that book. So she's in prison. We're talking in a context where someone's fingerprint is found on a book, is in prison.
That she threw away, a book that she threw away.
and a book that was actually printed by the government permission and everything. Nothing is illegal. And I wish I have written her name. I think Merve Akçura or something. And her daughter got serious lung pneumonia or something in the prison, and that's why it came up again. So a woman with a fingerprint on a book in the bin is imprisoned while Adil Öksüz is being released. And we're talking about government says this, government says that. In Sheffield University, there is a journalist, a professor of journalism, who made a very, very nice quote on this. He says, a journalist's job is not to quote on both sides and say, well, some people say it's raining outside and some people say it's not. It's his job is to look out and see what is the truth as well. And no one looks into that. You know, I find it really interesting why all these irregularities are not being questioned enough, because I don't have access to those questions. But if you look into how Adil Öksüz have been released, that's a total fabricated story as well. You know, as if the person who released him has a lot of trouble. No, that's if you look in detail, you know, that person has been protected as much as possible. You know, like 3,000 people have been persecuted on the spot, judges and prosecutors, and that guy, and there is a confusion who, you know, like they have persecuted the guy who didn't release, but the guy who resisted the release, you know, like the process got some other actors in it, isn't it? The prosecutor want him to remain in custody, like the others, as you would expect them to be, and but the judge decided to release, and the prosecutor takes it to another judge, and that judge decided to release him as well, and somehow he got lost after he released. So among these judges, two of them are not being persecuted. I think the second one is persecuted earlier or later, but then 35 people have been under scrutiny for that issue. They have gone under a judicial process. None of them has been, none of them have been punished in any way that girl has been punished because she threw away a book. And that is something it bothers my mind a lot. I can't see, why that would be an easy issue to just overlook, because this is the key person. We saw him on the news on that night. Everyone knew that he was arrested because that's a key idea that connects everything to Gülen.
Well, Turkey has said Adil Öksüz is hiding out in Germany now, or they did before, which Ankara also says is now home to the most significant and far-reaching network of the movement. In 2017, Germany granted asylum to several Turkish soldiers that Turkey was hoping to extradite for, apparent involvement in the coup. And this seemed to open the door for asylum seekers to Germany. Turkish officials now say as many as 14,000 Gülenists are in Germany. So in your view, is Germany today the preferred destination of exiled Gülenists? I ask in part because a welcoming government is crucial as Turkey continues its hunt. Just this week, Erdogan met with the president of Ukraine, who told reporters that Erdogan had mentioned to him specific names of Gülenists he should be looking out for.
Yeah, I mean, if you realize that the first country to declare Gülen members, ironically, is the first country to go in help of Erdogan, is England. But the problem is there are a lot of Turkish people already in Germany. There are a lot of Turkish communication, and people, when they come out from Turkey, the easiest destination to go to Germany. And asylum applications, as you would know, is not a political issue. It's a law issue. If there is a rule of law, you can stay no matter where you are coming from, and no political party can do anything about it because there are rules about the persecution. And the judges look at those rules. They don't look at how government wants to manage. For instance, in UK, we know UK government wants to remain friendly to Turkey about the Brexit stuff and everything. But on the other hand, they don't look at that. When things comes to court, which I witnessed some of the extradition cases in here, the judges are not looking at what really government wants to maintain and this and that. They look at the fact that whether this person, if I send him back, would he have a fair trial? And the answer to that is no, he won't. So they can't send him back by law. That will be a problem as far as And sometimes that's a perception issue. They say, this person, like I have seen a case where the person stayed more than 6 months, and the judge said, now if I send him, they'll ask him, and we can't expect him to lie. And if he says, I have applied for asylum and it was denied, then would he be persecuted? Yes, of course he would be persecuted. And the judge say, on that basis, I won't be able to send him. That everything else is irrelevant, whether he is a member or not. Now, after this point, overstaying his time in here, he become an issue where he would ask, we can't expect him to lie. So, I have to give him that. It's a human rights issue. And the judges are very, very, in Europe at least, very specific. I think the movement is not necessarily well planning in terms of its distribution. I think many people should go to English-speaking countries, but there isn't enough connection like that. Like Germany, there is a huge Turkish diaspora already. Everyone has a neighbor, a relative, someone that makes it familiar. Nowadays, for instance, I know Finland is a good destination because the things are fast, and now there is a growing number in there, and people call each other to Finland, and Finland is a very friendly country. So that sort of, it grows like a blind person moving on in a room by touching places. It's not a very well organized thing. I think actually in the first few months where there was a lot of room for coming out from Turkey, many Hizmet officials, which I met with some of them in following months to tell this as well. I said, you should have evacuate. It's going to a genocidal process. It's like gonna get worse and worse. But somehow people didn't want to believe that things could go worse until today. Now they are, especially after second election, some people whom I know who came here didn't open their luggages. And after the second election of Erdogan, I think after the coup attempt, I can't exactly remember the date. And he said, oh, I better learn English. I might have to stay here. So for a very long time, people even don't think that this was going to go this far. And I don't think people appreciate that how far it can go.
Well, speaking of it getting worse, I was struck by the story of Hakan Şükür, probably the best footballer or soccer player in Turkey's history. He went from being a sports icon in Turkey and an AKP parliamentarian who had Erdogan preside over his wedding to now he's driving an Uber in the US to make ends meet. But I'm guessing for the movement, his story is not so unusual, either back in Turkey or for those outside Turkey.
No, not at all. I have actually visited Canada and America. I've talked to him as well in detail about some of the issues he have had in the past. And then I have filmed some of the Uber drivers, some Amazon booksellers. I thought it might be a useful documentary, of course, without showing their faces, because no one wanted to show it. I'm talking about a year. I have a nice archive. A lot of people are doing food delivery in UK. A lot of people are in the lowest possible jobs. Nowadays, people are doing some cybersecurity courses, like where you can work from a computer and just code web pages or something. And there are some behaviors that are changing, but nothing is unusual about him. It's just you would expect him to have a bit more savings, that he could probably use it better and maybe a bit luckier. There are some businessmen who had a better, let's say, startup funds to be successful again abroad, but majority of the people actually hit the rock bottom and they are bouncing from there. And I'm saying this is the worst it can get. If you have seen any of the refugee camps in Greece, in Germany, I've visited all sizes of them. There are different sizes, different difficulties, and I really have a huge respect to people who are able to survive in those conditions. It makes my eye. It's really difficult. Like there are people. I've seen an old couple come to here recently. They have nothing to do with any of this controversy or anything, but they had to run away because the persecution is so horrible, and it's just it's probably designed to just make people, to put them off similar attempts or similar stuff. Like there is I can understand, I can make sense why it is happening. And
yes, 3.5 years later, it's still happening. Arrest orders were issued for 50 people in Konya province this week for links to Gülen. Will it ever end? I mean, you just said that you can imagine it might continue and get worse.
I think the thing here is the FETÖ coin and that coinage, in the English term, is a very useful term, thanks to the opposition parties wanted to get rid of some of their problems with that as well. So what the people are using is whatever they want to get rid of, because there is already an invested hatred on that. They're just calling each other FETÖ and try to harvest that in their own behavior, which fuels the fear and persecution and all that hatred, and goes in that unhelpful cycle, let's say. So I don't see why any government that comes after even AK Party would not use that, because it's still useful. They'll say, oh, these are the real FETÖ people, or for instance, if assume that İmamoğlu came to power, or Davutoğlu came to power, whichever Oğlu came to power, I think they will still use as we are now fighting with the real FETÖ, because there is already an invested hatred in there. This amount of hatred wasn't even fabricated for PKK in Turkey.
Well, this brings the question of how can the movement deal with this? Gökhan Başçık, who was in the past linked to the Gülen movement, said in a recent column for Ahval that far from being accountable and adapting to this new reality, the movement doesn't even appear to recognize it has any problems. He said Gülenists are confident that they will be vindicated once Erdogan leaves power in Turkey, and that they are just biding their time until then. What did you think of his piece? I saw that you commented on it in a YouTube video.
Yeah, I commented it in lengthy way, so I don't want to repeat. But in a way, I agree part of it. I can see which part he touches the movement and which part he actually first time gave some names as well. And yes, some people in the movement thinks that the things will go back in the same order, and that's unreasonable, but that's understandable for them to think, in that way. It's just. But it's a very wide brush to assume that nothing has changed, because many people doesn't even, like for instance, you've talked to Can Dündar as well, and I listened to that, and he was saying that there isn't a self-criticism. Obviously, we are not reading the same articles, or same things. I see Gülen has done a lot of changes in line with this crisis. For instance, when I make assumption about Adil Öksüz and his potential treason to Gülen, or some of his friends trying to protect him and stuff, I can see in the last 3.5 years, Gülen is not using the traditional, let's say, hierarchies in terms of his motivation to the movement. So which brings a question in such a crisis, why he is not effectively using these existing mechanisms to manage the movement very efficiently. Why he's not resorting to them? Probably he doesn't trust the mechanism as he used to trust before. So he thinks that there has been some infiltration by the MIT. Anything he says through them might be taken out of context and implemented differently. So he prefers an internet communication in 99% of his agenda, which is supporting, helping people who are in difficulty, deepening their own faith and remaining steadfast. And the third one is to follow up what he writes in Çağlayan, which no one does that. But in that articles, he's doing a great work on and a big problem in Islam, not necessarily for the movement only. If it's about self-criticism, I think it has been 25 articles so far. One of the fascinating series of articles, because I have read all of them, so like the previous ones, but I have only gone through half of them.
But wait, so it's a series about the idea of self-criticism. It's not actually criticizing the movement and what it's done or what he has done with the movement?
Well, he's not making it very overtly individual cases, but he's bringing, after the 5th, 6th article, especially when he brings it to facing ourselves, when he makes it the movement. There is 2 articles about that, where each paragraph he brings it to some, he implies some senior movement members, but he uses a wider brush because it's a bigger problem, and he's changing some of the stuff. I haven't seen where it's gonna lead, finally.
But you would say that in some way he has then been critical of the movement and even of himself?
Yes. Well,
so what if
himself is obvious.
If you could be specific, what sort of criticism?
Well, himself, it's a bit more obvious because he does that in his videos as well. And in some of them, he's very obviously says the way he debates with himself all night about whether I should do this way, maybe I could avoid this, and maybe I could avoid that, and this and that. He blames himself and tries to come out from that. And there is a period where you see actively he did that for a few months. He didn't actually come out from his room. And he wrote some poetry. That's strange and understandable from a Sufi point of view. He dedicated a bit of time just after the coup, went into silence and wrote what we called in Sufi terminology Naat and Munajat, meaning a kind of specific poetry towards the Prophet, which apparently he wanted always to do before he died. So that's like his self-reflecting period. Then he come out with Charlian magazine, where he started off what this road was about, what they were trying to do, the initial principles and everything in series of like 5-6 articles. Then he brought an article where he breaks everything into soil poisoning, like ruh zehirlenmesi, that specifically if your listeners want to read it. Mm-hmm. In there, he makes very clear that he's talking about the movement has affected from this, or people in the movement in certain numbers at least has been affected, and that made them go towards the world and forget about their ideals and this and that. And then in following articles he continues and details, and in there in some of the articles he specifically refers a term he uses as serkar, the movement seniors. That means like kahya, işbaşı, müdür in Turkish, but these are like principal but this, if you know exact like if the English speakers know exact translation, it's not a very respectful way of bringing them up, sort of, but recognizing some seniors, specifically mention them at the end of a paragraph and in many other locations, coining them. And it's very, very typical how he would write. And then later on, went and expands on another literature on the prophets, and every paragraph he brings back to the movement, and he says, we don't have this amount of even 1/10 of this self-criticism, otherwise we would have seen how bad we have become and repent and change our ways and this and that. But of course, it is not a...
So Gülen actually said we don't have enough self-criticism?
Yes. We don't have enough self-criticism, and I wish this is not one or two. I actually highlighted all of them on your Google Doc, so you can see, and some of them in one article, maybe 3-4 places where you think that maybe he's talking about Erdogan because of all these criticism, but he actually brings it back to I'm talking about the people who claim that they are the representative of the truth or the righteous way, meaning us.
Okay, just a couple more questions about the movement and about potential criticisms that others have had. Bacik in his column also pointed out that the movement has near zero women in prominent positions and leadership roles. Why is that?
Well, that's something I have criticized the moment Gülen brought up that 50% of women managers should be women, and I have said it's easy to say. We'll see whether he'll follow up, and I expected he would follow that up, but he didn't. And that is...
When did he mention that?
I think it was 2015 on Women's Day or 2016. I'm not sure because I have to look at it. But we have written something about that. We recognized then as a CHS, because everyone was really happy in there in a way to see that sort of a positive message. And then, but I said, you know what, this is not the first time he says this. So he says many times, let's, put our point in there that it needs some repetition or follow up. But the problem in there is that if you were in Gülen, for instance, the way he's expected to lead by even Gökhan Bacik on and some of his critics, they want him to be, it's I know it's like an oxymoron, but people want him to make changes in a way that you don't want to have, like they want him to be the authoritarian leader and make those changes, enforce them top to down. But then again, the main problem is about why it is not democratic enough and why there isn't enough people taking part in the processes and stuff.
So he should be more authoritarian and less authoritarian.
Yes, that's the problem. In a way, I see there is enough theoretical argument he puts out there. For instance, one of the Alliance for Shared Values, the first document they send, number 6 article says that if anyone comes to you with any illegal, immoral, against rules and principles expectation or an order, no matter how senior his affiliation with the movement or with the Gülen himself, reject his idea and his personality, sort of. So that in itself recognizes that people might do that. Like senior members of the movement might actually come to you and ask you to do something illegal and immoral. And he clearly says, ask his followers to just reject them, their message and them. But is it implemented? No, because people don't have that confidence really to implement that. But it's like how far you can, because in my opinion, which I explained this in a moment, Gülen didn't make up his movement from individuals and bring them together. He created a common identity of movement from, let's say, less educated, more from a crowd, let's say. In Turkish, I would explain it better, but from a crowd, he make up a movement. Now he's probably tried to break it into individuals and ask them to come together. So it's
What about the 2000s? Does Gülen and some of the leaders of the movement, did they acknowledge that there were mistakes made, such as in the Ergenekon trials and jailing opposition journalists and all this, before there were any tensions with the AKP?
I don't specifically look into that, so I won't be able to say that. But if you were to mention learning from mistakes and correcting their ways, they are the golden times, especially to renew its ways and coming out new ways. For instance, when the 1998, when this school takeover idea came in by the military leaders at that time, Gülen was very proactive and he said, you don't need to take over the schools or try to attempt that. We want to hand over them to you. And then at that time, I think Ibrahim Hakkı Karaday, I think they had to calculate how much it would have cost to them, and they decided not to. First, initially, they wanted to clamp down the movement by taking over the schools, and when movement offered it, they had to make a calculation and they go back. The same thing happened when Erdogan wanted to take over the schools and the dormitories. And apparently, Gülen suggested the same thing, but which wasn't reverberated in Zaman media. That's very strange. It came out later, say, well, actually, Gülen suggested that we should hand it over, not give a fight about it, because these are public institutions. There is no fight as far as they can continue to do the support work. But so you can see that Gülen, although according to Mustafa Yeşil, suggested that let's hand it over, the movement or whoever take that action actually give a very big fight about that there's a crisis, you see. So that's why, it's not, I'm not saying this to like defend anything. It's not simple enough to read everything like if this happened, that's because Gülen wanted it to happen, because then people who did that want you to think that way as well, because they don't want to put their agency in there, and they say they want to take it, and they do that on behalf of Gülen and that's how they become powerful in a way. If that was their idea, people will criticize. But if you come up to moment lead, followers and say, yeah, but this is what Gülen wants us to do, and people will say, okay, then he might know something better than us, so let's follow his lead.
All right. Well, one last question about something that they might have done. Ahmet Şık and other journalists have written that Gülenists recruited and brainwashed young students, then pushed them into the police or the military and used them as spies. Is that something that the movement did? Have you heard anything about that?
I wouldn't frame it in that way, because there is a lot of, like the same action can be framed in a different way. Brainwashing is a very disrespectful term to all these educated people who, in this occasion, would be able to still articulate why they do what they do. So I don't agree with that. But I can understand and appreciate, or at least see the potentiality of that the movement members might have actually abused their powers, especially in a way that no one can detect it as well. So I think the big responsibility on the movement is to set up certain parameters now after facing this crisis to make sure that sort of potential abuse areas are not there anymore, because you can see there was a lot of huge amount of trust. People don't even question each other. People weren't even questioning each other in terms of their goodwill and stuff. And that creates a lot of loopholes, a lot of gray areas where a lot of abuse might have happened. And on that note, for instance, again, when Ahmet Şık was arrested and Nedim Şener was arrested, Gülen published a piece, denouncing that action, and he said the writers and journalists wouldn't have to face persecution because of their ideas, which is on there, was published by Zaman, but the main line of the movement was in a different place. So it was far, far bigger, especially the Turkish Hizmet organization was far bigger than Gülen at the time, I think, and Gülen actually lost control in there. And I think partly that's why he's trying to actually change the things that are happening now, because he has seen and actively what it could happen. And many movement member now sees that, and there is no unconditional trust anymore. There is a huge trust crisis in there, which will lead the transformation of the movement or eradication of it in either way, because the movement was really heavily relying on that trust which they have created over the 1980s and 1990s by doing everything with their hands, and then they started handing over those responsibilities to certain Hizmet member officials and this and that, which then we can see that even if it's not abused, we can see that it could have been abused. I'm assuming it was abused as well. So, but I wouldn't frame it the way Ahmet Şık, because I'm coming from a very overtly religious background, and I haven't applied any government position after I graduated from political science and international relations, because I have a certificate from a madrasa which was converted in 1998 pressure. It was an illegal madrasa converted into certificate giving madrasa. So I have a certificate. So I know I wouldn't be able to even go through in AK Party regime in 2004-5. I wouldn't be able to get anywhere with that credential. So I thought I'll go out and do academia and try to go on my own, because I know no matter who says what, we are not, as religiously observant people in a general brush, we are not expected to be in certain circles.
Well,
and that's why...
Speaking of handing over responsibilities, Gülen, I believe, is about to turn 79. What have you heard about his health? Is he still appearing in videos and photos?
I think he's still appearing regularly, but there was a health complication recently. For a while, he wasn't available for the video. But of course, many people expect to see him on a regular basis to see that everything is okay. So he gives into that pressure. So he tries to be available regularly. And sometimes people spread this information about his health issues. So you can easily see Osman Şimşek or some senior members just film him for a couple of minutes during a lesson time. And in my recent visits, I have visited recently a couple of times, and then I've seen that he was regular about his teaching sessions in the morning with his students. He never misses that. But for the rest of the activities, he's a bit more reluctant, a bit more withdrawn. And the thing that he constantly does is his lead articles in Çağlayan, which is about, in general, I explain about the self-criticism and in Islamic terms, muhasebe, the culture of self-accounting, which is a big issue for entire Muslim world in a way. I think he's still there. Like I don't see he's very, very fragile. I think he's a bit worried. Maybe the way he appeared every week might have probably provoked AK Party to do further damage. For that reason, he avoided. In one of his videos, he said that. So that's how I understood that. He said, I wasn't speaking for a while. Maybe that would, maybe my speaking caused some harm, but they don't stop, So there is no correlation between. And he made a short speech like that. So you can see that he gives and takes in terms like whether I should be out there and give people hope that they expect from me, or maybe I should just cool things down, as there is a lot of people who believes that the movement should go in a hibernation position, pretend to be dead, so that this saga is over.
Well, what do you think will happen to the movement when its founder and leader passes away? Do you see somebody being able to replace him, or might the movement just sort of wither away after that?
Well, I'm aware that at least three main actors have plans for that. One of them is the Turkish state. When I mean it's not Erdogan, but the Turkish state has this habit of infiltrating and using and abusing these religious institutions. So there is very few religious movements which they don't have really manipulation power in Turkey. So I think, and I believe in this since the day one, because the state never wanted to destroy an international instrument. They just wanted to use it. It is very similar to Chinese Falun Gong in a way. If the Communist Party was able to convince Falun Gong to be a soft philosophical power to replace ancient Chinese things with the communist version, they wouldn't have been persecuted. Similarly, if Erdogan or the state were able to utilize enough the movement and its infrastructure and its influence overseas in their own soft political power, they wouldn't have this problem. It's just, it looks like Gülen didn't want to negotiate that influence, so which means that they had to crush, and it was very obvious since 2010 maybe that this was going to happen in a way, maybe in different fashion. So the state, I think, is persecuting some specific movement members and probably allowing some others to be coming into more senior positions. So they have a plan, in my opinion, who or what sort of a system will take over Gülen movement after Gülen. But in my opinion, they are not feeling safe in that sort of a follow-up plan. So hence Gülen is alive. Otherwise, probably they would have assassinated it to promote that agenda. But I think they are very influential because it's very easy to become a senior Hizmet person. There isn't really very tough challenges on the way. If your job is to just infiltrate and do, it's the easiest place to do in that sense. And Gülen has a plan, which I would contemplate at the end of this. And I think some Hizmet members, senior members, have planned after him. Although they don't want to discuss that a lot, you can see there is a preparation, people feeling like they need to prepare. And all of them has certain experience and certain ideas about how it would be best to continue. And the main theme out there is like a group of senior members to take over. Seems more sensible. But then again, there are a number of groups of senior members that have to compete for that sort of a coalition. But they are, in a way, you can see a coalition of all, in a way. That's possible. Although if they can't achieve I don't want to give any names at this point, you would understand why. And I think Gülen himself, with his previous experience as a third agent who wants to envisage an post-Gülen period, I think he wants to leave behind a more stronger individual representation of people in the movement, where people have a bit more power and institutions are a bit more represented by those people rather than a top-down organization, because he has faced with such an organization. After Said Nursi passed away, a group of his students actually represented Hizmet charity at that time, and in 5-10 years time he was actually in an opposition position in that place. So he had really difficult time with those people who, in his opinion, couldn't really carry out the Said Nursi's vision, so he had to part away. So I don't think he wants to leave behind a conservative group of people running the business top to down, no matter how sensible it looks like. So
does that mean he wants to select one single leader, or like a community of leaders? What are you suggesting?
I don't think he would be able to do that based on what he has thought. That's one of the things people ignore. For instance, one of the reasons why I believe that the Gülen was not involved in this coup attempt is because it's so against his teachings that it would have finished the movement if he had done so. Similarly, singling out one individual person would be so against his idea of ferdun minen nas, that's the original term, being person among the people, Like, for instance, there are strange things. If you follow up closely, for instance, when he comes into for his lessons, no one is allowed to stand up. It's a typical Turkish cultural thing to stand up for the teacher. But he doesn't like that, for instance. But his followers, his students, when they go in somewhere, everyone stands up. So there are strange things within the movement. It's very hard to see how many of his teachings will pass into next generation. But I don't think he wants to hand over that sort of responsibility to a single person. At least I can't see who that would be, because you would have an imagination. You can see he's abstaining to single out anyone, even in this crisis. There is a lot of expectation of him to at least single out a press person to speak on behalf of the movement, like at least an institution like Alliance for Shared Values. He resists to that because that would mean that that is a bit of representative of Gülen or his position. Hence, people will try to become committee members in there to be prominent after Gülen, and this he will trigger a lot of issues if he singles that out, because he'd singled Writers and Journalists Foundation at a time in Turkey, which almost act on his behalf in Turkey, and I don't think he's very happy with the outcome, let's say. But I mean, like, he's very, very, very obviously, I can't emphasize enough, he's very obviously abstaining to use some of the tools available to him, and partly because it can be abused later. So he's not even, even to resolve this crisis sooner, he could have used some of the tools available to him, which he's not. And it's a very, very tempting issue. He could be able to use some people to manage the crisis easier and to solve issues easier and stuff. But I think he wants people to get used to this age, and which is working. If you look around, there is a lot of institutions popping up, and I know most of their stories, and 99% of them are very organic. People fed up of nothing being happening, and they set up these institutions and work, and those gives inspiration to other institutions. In that sense, for instance, when we set up Video on TR, it wasn't really a good idea, but you can see a lot of YouTube channels now, which in a way I inspired with this attempt. And you can see similarly, like Stockholm Center for Freedom Studies, which was a brainchild of Abdullah Bozkurt, inspired other institutions, for instance. It's like a lot of people with this lack of action take action, and which is in a way, it goes in line with Gülen's, some of his articles, like where he describes that sort of a slow coming back by individual responsibility. In his terms, the flowering of the flower buds, however you think it, you should just allow them to have some time, take responsibility and take ownership. And it's
so it sounds like more and more change and uncertainty for the Gülen movement in the days and years ahead.
It does, because of the perception. You see, if you know Gülen in 60s and 70s, he's a micromanager. If you go 80s, he's like a bit distant manager. If you go 90s, he's like delegated a lot of stuff. And in 2000, he's almost non-existent. Some of the stuff that he openly calls for is implemented otherwise, like Ahmet Şık, Nedim Şener case, like when he calls out 1 million people to leave Turkey. These are all implemented totally against his will, in a different way, not against, let's don't say that, but in a different way by the movement. But he didn't have a problem with that. In Mavi Marmara cases, he followed up with his movement. His own words have been filtered in his own newspaper. So, so you can see he's going in line with removing himself from that micromanaging position to non-management at all. It's going in line. It's understandable for a researcher point of view what he's trying to achieve. Whether he could achieve is a different issue.
He's basically been letting go of the reins for 20, 30 years, you're saying.
And some of the problems are, that's why we had some of the problems. That's why I won't be able to give you an answer. For instance, if you were to tell me, well, has movement abused its power? Because I know within the movement, there's a lot of people who would abuse its power. For instance, when my wife asked me, I said, the Gülen wouldn't allow such a coup attempt because it would be suicide for his ideology. But there are people who are like crazy enough to promote that idea. That's very obvious, because not everyone looks at it as a philosophical movement. Some people looks at it as a way to get power, as a way to get a job. It used to be a case where people used to come to movement to get to somewhere, and as soon as the movement fell out with the government, which I think wasn't welcomed by a lot of senior movement members as well, and people start, parting their ways, because actually they knew it won't be a good means, to reach their ends. But that's not what his concern at this point. Otherwise, he could have just stayed calm. I always say this, when this corruption allegation comes, all he had to do is to just say, well, we believe that everyone is innocent until they are proven guilty. We won't talk bad about our fellow brothers until they are proven guilty in a court. So we'll shut up on this issue.
That's and what Erdogan should have said? Yeah.
If Gülen said that, that would be Islamically justifiable, And if he were to ask Zaman to be silent about corruption and stuff, and and that would be, Gülen would be the best person, still, the best, like the most respected person in Turkey. But that means that he would have lost all his potential influence. All philosophy should have gone to drain when it comes to, we are talking about the truth and the justice and this and that. When it comes to an obvious corruption case about a government, you just be covered and silent, like the other scholars today are being, just cooperative, or at least keeping silent. So it would have lost him all of his 40-50 years of work. So he couldn't have done that. He had to at least part his ways, although there was a lot of pressure within the movement that things should continue because Erdogan will go and the movement will prevail. We just had to hang out there. Don't get into fight with him. Don't get against him because he's very, very venomous against his enemies. We don't want to be there, this and that. But he actually made a very obvious choice in a very public meeting, which gives the movement a very clean signal. They had to part their ways, which created a lot of trouble within the circles of the movement. I witnessed that period because many people didn't want that happening, but it did anyway. So that's why they're paying the price. And it got delayed. It got delayed a very long time because of that pressure. Many people, like if you remember when Melih Gökçek was preparing the documentary about Erdogan, they wanted a few words from Gülen to praise Erdogan, and he didn't want to give that. And that phone conversation with Hidayet Karaca and Gülen was leaked. That Gülen did say, "Can't you see what he's doing? Why would I praise him?" And Hidayet Karaca said it would be nice to avoid any confrontation and this and that. And Gülen said, in that case, write something, after insistence, write something appropriate, and I will just go with it. But I don't want to really say anything.
It's funny to think that these two were recently trying to avoid confrontation. I think we'll have to end it there. Otherwise, we'll keep talking all day. Yeah. Ismail Sezgin, thank you so much for your time and insight. It was a very illuminating conversation.
I hope so. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope this was helpful to your listeners to understand a little better.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.